Dr. Kathryn Stoner, thank you so much for joining Exit Strategy Podcast this morning. I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on was because I wanted to get an update and talk about all things Russia-Ukrainian war. But before we get into that, I wanted to give you a brief introduction because I'd like to inform my listeners about why you're an expert in all of this. So yeah, you have an impressive resume, impressive title. Mosbacher Director and Senior Fellow, Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. You're Friedman-Spogli Institute for International Studies with Stanford University, Professor of Political Science, and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute. Is there anything else? Does that cover it?
That's a proud mother and a dog parent as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming on this morning. Let's jump right into the news, the breaking news. That Mr. Putin has just announced a mobilization of 300,000 troops for, I guess, a new wave of military operations into Ukraine, with also an announcement that that nuclear option was not off the table, and he ended with that this is not a bluff. That just came out moments ago. What do you make of this? Are we in trouble? Are we not in trouble? Is this in fact a bluff? What should we make of this?
So I don't know. I haven't seen anywhere that he said the nuclear option is available, but it is implied, whether or not he expressly said that.
Right.
And that's because if in fact a referenda that the so-called separatists are planning in Luhansk and Donetsk, and then the two other Russian occupied territories in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, that if those pass, and I think it's fair to assume, Jody, that they will, because they're not free and fair at all, of course, and they're being conducted under occupation, that those territories would then be, in Russia's view at least, part of Russia. And so if Ukraine were to continue to try to take them back and attack them, then that would be viewed as an attack on the fatherland or motherlands, depending on your preferred, the homeland term. And so Russian nuclear doctrine was revised in the last couple of years to enable first strike with nuclear weapons if it is judged that the homeland is under threat. So this is what he was alluding to. This is the concern. And to answer your question, yes, I think there's more trouble here. We could talk about when people say this is not a bluff after they make a statement, or I'm not kidding, whether that means they're kidding or it is a bluff. But certainly he means to rattle the nuclear sabers here with that statement.
Right. Yeah, interesting. I did now I wanted to discuss your book, and you'll have to remind me exactly when this came out. The title, Russia Resurrected: Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. One of the other questions I wanted to ask was, I believe this was written and published before this conflict broke out. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was published in January 2021.
Okay. But
we should think about this conflict as not starting, with February 24th, 2022. It of course started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and then the Russian support for so-called separatists in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine. So what we saw was a new stage in intensification, obviously, that began February 24th of this year. So the thing we try to do as academics and not journalists is, to make sure that we're not chasing headlines. So there's I think it's still pretty relevant, and happy to talk more about it.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, tell us. Yeah, maybe I guess explain or tell us how we should be thinking about this in terms of the historical timeline, and then we can segue into your book and what your main thesis and arguments were, because I'm curious about why you wrote that book then, during that year, or why it came out then, and what was happening around that time that gave you the impetus to write the book?
Yeah, so I really actually started it in gosh, academics, we start things a lot sooner than they actually come out. But I started it in 20, probably 14, maybe 13. It takes, on and off, and things started to change a little bit. But what I was sort of reacting to initially in starting this book was a statement by someone who used to be very high up in the National Intelligence Council, saying that here in the United States, saying that Russia was weak and that it was, almost the same as North Korea in terms of it wanted to be a strong power, it wanted to be a great power, but it was, the metaphor he used, since I think he came to speak at Stanford around Thanksgiving, was that they want to be at the big table with the grown-ups, as grown-ups are at Thanksgiving, but really they're at the little table with the North Koreas of the world. And this just struck me as a fundamental, as a lifelong student of Soviet and then Russian politics, fundamental misread of Russia, especially under Putin since 2012 and his return to the presidency, and that it was dangerous to do this because that was underestimating and misunderstanding power in the contemporary context. And sure, and so that's really what the book is about, is rethinking power and how we think about power. So sure, if you think about the Russian military relative to the US military, it doesn't look very powerful, except in the nuclear realm, where Mr. Putin said today, and unfortunately he's correct, Russia does have some weaponry that is more advanced than ours. Whether it works is a question, but it has, at least most of it's been tested. But power is also the will to use it, right? And so I look at different forms of power, not just military and economic, but also sharp power. That is what we saw, for example, in the 2016 elections, right? Changing the information environment, using bots and trolls and whatnot. And then it's economic power. Obviously, Europe's feeling this in particular now, but we all are. I drive an electric car, fortunately. But the price of gas has gone up and down. That's from oil prices, and Russia's a major player. Not just in selling oil, but also in moving it, so owning pipelines. And that also is a form of power, right? Power is getting countries to do things that they might not otherwise do. And as Europe is experiencing now, Russia is obviously, if Europeans didn't know it before, they sure know it now, that Russia was the main supplier, for example, of Germany, Europe's biggest economy, with natural gas. And we use natural gas in a whole bunch of things, not just in many people use it in your stoves, but use it for heating, you use it for air conditioning, and factories, run on it because it was thought to be a clean source of fossil fuel relative to oil. So that gives Russia tremendous leverage. It doesn't matter the size of its military if it can cut off oil or gas. And the big issue right now is gas. So, when you think of different forms of power, you think of it in multidimensional terms, then, Russia is more than just the size of its economy, right? It's what makes up that economy and its importance in the global economy. And it's more than the size of its military. It's the capacity or spending on its military. It's the capacity the military has, the types of weapons, and then the ability to use those and the will to use them. And so I'll just end with this, that the book then links, Russia's foreign policy and how it's begun to move more around the world, not just, we're seeing it in Ukraine, but the book also looks at Russia's presence in the last 20 to 25 years, in particular in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Central America, in Latin America, and the ties that it has built there. And it links it to its domestic politics and the fact that this is a personalistic, highly now increasingly repressive hypocrisy. And so some of what it does in foreign policy, including in Ukraine, is to maintain this system and Mr. Putin in power in particular.
Fascinating. No, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think one of the largest, well, not the largest, but one of the things that's often missed in the geopolitical analysis of kind of anything is a sort of glossing over of the economics that are underpinning conflict, the economics that underpin wars, and the inevitable energy politics that are coming into conflicts that happen in the 21st century, right? I mean, is that a correct thing to say?
Yeah, and these are, amplifiers of Russian influence, right? Ultimately, power is influence. It's the ability to get you to do something you might not otherwise do. And so, I think we have consistently in the last 10 to 15 years underestimated the influence that Russia has under Mr. Putin gradually built up in other parts of the world. And this influence is not ideological necessarily, although there is that component we can talk about. And it's different from the way the Soviet Union moved in the world. And there is some empathy toward this. Russia and China have a tight relationship right now. Same with India. Well, those are the two most populous countries in the world, and they've also grown, until COVID, very big growing economies. So anyway, that's what the book talks about. But it does, one of the arguments here too is that it's not inevitable the way Russia behaves. Under Mr. Putin, this has been a strategic choice, right? So there's nothing structural or cultural that makes Russia an enemy of the West. He's chosen this, and it is partly to keep himself in power and with a certain kind of government. And that's the threat that Ukraine presents to Mr. Putin, is that, it's attempting to join the European Union. Its people are clearly demonstrating they want a more open form of government than, the example Mr. Putin sets in Russia. And this is what they're fighting for.
Does Putin have a point? Do Russian elites have a point that this was that this is being pushed? And I guess even some Western academics have argued this, that they have been indeed being pushed by Washington since 2014, or is that just a weak way of looking at, or is that just Russian propaganda at work? How should you view this?
It is Kremlin propaganda, and it is a certain way of looking at the world, right? And so this, I actually just was at the American Political Science Association meetings in Montreal this past weekend, and on a panel with one of the proponents of that kind of argument. That's a realist argument, and it's a view of the world is made up of great powers.
Right.
And great powers like Russia and Europe and the United States seek to enhance their power. And so the wars they fight are over the little peoples in between these, geographical entities.
Sure.
And okay, well, that's the 19th century view of the world. And since 1945, and it led to war, right? Almost a constant state of war in Europe. Well, since 1945, and we're watching the United Nations General Assembly right now this week in New York, that is not the way we have run the world, right? Countries have rights, and they are sovereign, and we don't take over our neighbors because we don't like their form of government. And we, that is also an excuse and factually wrong. Ukraine was not about to join NATO in 2013 when people came out on the streets, or 2014 when Crimea was annexed. There had not been any expansion to Russia's borders since 2009, before Russia grabbed Crimea in 2014. And so this, NATO, if anything, by expanding, was made weaker, really, because of the Article 5 commitment. Do you really think Americans are going to go to war to defend North Macedonia? They can't even find North Macedonia, right? And perhaps the mistake was in the ambiguity Ukraine found itself in. right? They even offered neutrality. This was all done between December and February of last year and this year, before Putin invaded in February. They offered neutrality. They offered not to join NATO, but it wasn't enough, and that's not what this is about at all. It is about Ukrainians looking to a liberal democratic model from the European Union and wanting to join the European Union and create accountable forms of government, and Russia not wanting to have that example, Mr. Putin's Russia, on its borders. Because then what?
Right.
Russians will ask, well, why can't we have that?
I'm curious what the panelists' response was, because I mean, I'm certainly accused of being a shill. You're just by saying that, people would say, or supporters of the Russian side would certainly would say that you're a sort of a tool or a mouthpiece for the State Department, right? I mean, you certainly have probably come across this before.
I'm banned. Actually, I was banned from Russia this summer because they just that's an indication of ridiculous fear, right? They just can't. Intolerance for criticism. I'm an academic, for Pete's sake. I've never had a job with the U.S. government.
But they rattle off all of these like bullet points that the State Department was directly involved in a 2014 coup that installed a NATO-friendly. What do you say to this? Is this the broader information war that's happening?
Yeah, it's factually. I mean, that's factually incorrect. Okay, so show us some evidence of that, of any of that. And
they always point to the woman who is found on the tape. Do you know what I'm talking about? I can't remember her name. I'm sorry. I should have had that prepared.
Newman,
Victoria. Yes, correct. Yes.
Victoria. Yes. Well, that's ridiculous, right? Okay. So in 2000, that's the Orange Revolution in 2004. I think she handed out cookies or something like that. Listen, this is just the way Mr. Putin's worldview, right? He thinks the CIA is so much more capable than it is. Really, we wish that we had that. Did you see Iraq? Did you see what happened there?
Right.
We wish that we had that kind of ability in our foreign intelligence agencies in the State Department. But the reality is we don't. I mean, look at how successful we have been in spreading democracy globally. Not so good, right? There has to be an indigenous movement to do that. There has to be something domestically within a country that demands democracy. So let's look around Ukraine's borders, right? Obviously, big border with Russia, border with Belarus, border with Poland, member of the European Union, right? So this has been something that in democratic elections, and even Mr. Putin would have to note that the president that was ousted in 2014, he was 5 years earlier democratically elected in Ukraine. And one of the promises he made, which sparked, his not following through on it, sparked Euromaidan, was to sign an initial accession agreement for Ukraine with the European Union. Putin bribed him basically out of that with promise of funding to help the Ukrainian budget. And he didn't sign that agreement to begin the accession procedure. This is November, this is Yanukovych, in November of 2013. People come out onto the street in what they called the Revolution of Dignity in Kyiv. And in February 2014, Yanukovych flees, and Russia takes Crimea and begins this low-boil separatist war. Then elections are held for a new President Poroshenko. Then he loses elections to 5 years later to Mr. Zelensky. So Mr. Zelensky, before Mr. Putin invaded in February of this year, was polling around 30% in terms of approval ratings. Ukraine was not about to join NATO. Finland and Sweden weren't in NATO. And now Mr. Zelensky is wildly popular. Ukrainian national identity, because of the war, Ukrainian national identity has been forged through war. Finland and Sweden are joining NATO. And so what exactly has Mr. Putin accomplished here, other than ruining his own country and ruining his neighbor? So anyway, this is it is absurd, right? And NATO it's a defensive alliance. It was not aggressing against Russia. But he thinks NATO is the same as the European Union. Of course, it's not. And he thinks that countries have spheres of influence that are historical, and they do not. Countries are sovereign, and this was something that was promised in 1994 with something called the Budapest Memorandum that Mr. Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, first president of Russia, signed, respecting the sovereignty of Ukraine, Belarus, and other states within that had been part of the Soviet Union that had legacy nuclear weapons. So that's the promise that has been broken, to respect those borders. And there was zero provocation. What is the provocation for this invasion? It is not a preventive war. Prevent from what? What was about to happen? Ukraine was not about to join NATO in February of this year. There was nothing that was about to happen.
Interesting. Let's turn the tables a little bit, because I know before you mentioned the role of China, the role of India, and I guess I'm asking a larger geopolitical question, or maybe a realist political question, or of within international relations. But and it's very sophomoric. Where are those states in terms of this conflict? Like, so has the relationship between Russia and China, for example, been strengthened? Or is China just kind of staying neutral? I mean, certainly we know in the international arena, they've abstained, right, from well, I'll just let you speak. What are those states doing? And I guess I'm concerned with China, specifically India, which is right there with North Korea. Well, what's their relationship now with Russia, and what's been happening?
Yeah, so my first answer is chapter 3, Jody, of Russia Resurrected, talks about how Russia has built under Mr. Putin in particular in the last 10 to 15 years relationships throughout the world, and two of those and very important ones are with China and India. So, you know, what's the nature of those relationships? Well, so let's look at China first. China, obviously, biggest population in the world, right? Huge economy, rivaling the size of the United States. It needs energy to keep that economy going, to keep, that's Mr. Xi's and the Communist Party's challenge, right? Keep people employed and basically fat and happy, and not challenging the Communist Party's control. So how does Russia fit into that? Well, energy. China needs all kinds of it. It doesn't have a lot of oil itself. It doesn't have a lot of natural gas. It has some coal, but not enough. And so what Russia is right there on its border and has all of those things. And so that is largely what Russia supplies to China. And in return, China, provides Russia with all kinds of goods, as it does the rest of the world. And as we, especially following the sanctions that we began to apply after 2014 and the seizure of Crimea from Ukraine, we obviously started sanctions on Russia then. So China has stepped in to try and fund some of the projects that US and European countries had to abandon after those sanctions were imposed in 2014. And so Russia also was getting investment from China. So now, since February, how has this changed? Well, Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin, over the last 8 years or so, saw each other possibly the most of any other foreign leader. They referred to one another as their very best friends in the world, and they also had, an interest. The Chinese have an interest in the northern transportation route, that passage through the Arctic, and global warming is beginning to help with that. And Russia has icebreakers, so lots of different ways of connecting and coordinating. Now, Xi is not terribly enthusiastic about this war, but remember in February of this year, Putin went to China before the war began, and they declared, this was an unshakable relationship, and so clearly told him ahead of time, this is what's going to happen, and and we need your support. So what has he gotten? Well, we just saw at this meeting in Central Asia last week some indication that China's not that happy with how this war has gone. Likely, Putin assured Xi this would be quick. It has not been quick. It has not been easy. The Ukrainians have fought back. Certainly.
Why would they care about that, though? I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, and maybe that's a naive question, but why would China care whether or not this is a quick conflict or quick war?
Well, it begins to affect them, right? If they look like the Chinese are too strongly supporting Russia in this war against the U.S. in particular, although China has leverage over us, it holds a lot of debt and whatnot. We have a lot of leverage over China. We're a pretty big market. So is Europe. And although, we have our big problems with Xi, didn't count on this and instability and, an increase in prices and would prefer stability and pursuing their own interests with Belt and Road and whatnot. And so this is disruptive, and that's not in China's interest. What is in China's interest is since Russia is losing the European market for oil and natural gas, this is going to hurt the Europeans in the short run, of course, especially since Russia's kind of shutting it off, right? Some of their, the Europeans aren't going to go back to Russia for natural gas. So this leaves Russia now dependent on China to buy it up. And to complete one big pipeline in particular that's not finished to move natural gas into China. And so where does the financing come from? China. So this is a very mixed bag for the Chinese.
Where's Europe going to get their natural gas then? If they're refusing not to go back? I mean, are we going to start supplying by shipment?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That is what's happening actually. So natural gas, unlike oil, comes out of the ground as a vapor, as an actual gas. And so that means it's a little bit harder to move, and it moves through pipelines. And so that's how Europe got so dependent on Russia. The geographical proximity meant that pipelines carry it from Russia into Europe and Germany in particular. But now we have the technology in the US has with, a lot of people are kind of don't like the environmental effects of shale gas, but shale gas and oil have put the U.S. back on the map as a major exporter of both of these things. Although we don't export a ton of oil, we do natural gas. And so what we do is we liquefy it, and we can put it on tankers out of Louisiana and other places and send it around the world. And
I'm in New Orleans right now, so very well aware. That's our main.
Oh, okay. I have a kid who lives down there actually.
Okay.
But great city. But so, I mean, in a sense, this is good for New Orleans because you're liquefying natural gas, putting it on tankers. And now we have to help, the Europeans make sure that they can turn that liquefied natural gas back into vapor. And so this is a bit of an issue for the Europeans. It'll take some infrastructural investment. But once that's in place, they don't need the Russians anymore. So this is just catastrophic for the Russian economy in 1 to 2 to 3 years. And the Chinese are now under tremendous pressure from the Russians to try to make up the difference. But it's the European market for Russian natural gas isn't just gone for now; it's going to be gone forever, and we can make up that difference, as can other parts of the world, by the way.
It's fascinating that New Orleans is a port city, and then the state Louisiana, such an energy producing state, is going to have such major geopolitical impact across the entire world.
Yeah. It matters a lot. Yeah.
Interesting. What about India? What about North Korea? I mean, are there powers that are there countries that are becoming more powerful, or maybe
influence?
Or who have inadvertently gained from this that they maybe have, that we didn't see before?
Well, North Korea, I think not really. Russia's purportedly buying some weaponry from North Korea, which I think shows desperation. It also, just to point out, where the Chinese and the ambiguity of their support for this, where they don't seem to be selling back any weaponry to Russia. Russia's the second largest purveyor of weapons around the world. We're number one, but Russia's number two. And so they sell to China, to North Korea, and to India. So that's going to also impact the Chinese and the Indians. North Korea, I think this is nothing, right? That's just not very useful to Russia particularly. But India, again, huge economy, huge population, very Mr. Modi, especially as he's become less and less of a Democrat and more of a sort of Hindu nationalist, has developed pretty warm relations with Mr. Putin. He's there a lot. But from the comments we heard this past weekend, again, in the meeting in Central Asia, there was an allusion to Modi in private, probably also saying, hey, and we did see that Putin say this, this isn't, and Modi said it too, this isn't the time for war. So why is he doing that? Well, not necessarily for us here in the West, but again, because it is disruptive, right? It's disruptive to global markets. It's raising the prices of oil and gas, although this again gives India some leverage over Russia to negotiate contracts for oil and natural gas at lower prices, because Russia needs to sell it. It's going to need new markets. But this is very disruptive of global markets, and that's not in India's interest. And also, if this goes on, then how is the Russian defense industrial complex going to continue to supply India with some of the weaponry it's ordered from Russia over the last couple of years? So that's also, from the Indian perspective, problematic.
Yeah. Where do you see Ukraine in? And I know I don't want to ask you to predict the future. I know IR specialists try to stay out of that game as much as possible, but I must ask.
People get tempted into it.
I know sometimes it happens. Sometimes it happens anyway, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But we do know, they're wildly in debt, right? I think after
the Russians?
No, Ukraine.
Oh.
So, or they're going to be, right?
I would think so, but well, go ahead. What's your question?
Well, I guess that's the question. Where do you see Ukraine's place after this? I really am asking you to predict the future. Where do you see this all going? Especially when we talk about war as a game of economics, what's going to wind up happening with the Ukrainian economy? What's going to happen to that country, say, a year from now, 5 years from now?
Well, that is a bazillion-dollar question.
Right.
So most immediately, this morning, Mr. Putin, made a speech that was expected yesterday, and then never happened. That Russia is now going to mobilize up to 300,000 more reservists to he is saying consolidate control over the Donetsk, Luhansk regions, but also Kherson and Zaporizhia. And they're going to hold referenda starting Friday on whether or not these regions will become part of Russia. So that's important for Ukraine's future, because that cuts off, should they actually be able to occupy those and effectively annex them into Russia, that cuts off 20% of Ukraine. I don't think this is going to end the conflict doing this. So first of all, we can't really talk about Ukraine's future without talking about how this is going to happen, or this is going to go down in the next couple of months. So it's going to take the Russian military a while to be able to digest and deploy 300,000 troops, if they even get that many, right? These are reservists.
Right.
Some of them will know how to use the weaponry. Some of them will not and need to be trained on it. Some of them will just be cannon fodder. But it is more, it is numbers, right? So will these referenda that are going to be held pass? to join Russia? I would predict yes,
Yeah,
because they're not.
let's assume that that it
Yeah.
does.
Right,
So
they're not free and fair, right? Like
Exactly.
they're not. Yeah, and like with Crimea, I'm sure one of the questions that is not on the ballots will be, or do you want to remain part of Ukraine? So the Crimeans were never asked that. It's, do you want to be independent? Do you want to be part of us? And that's what's going to happen here too. So that's completely illegal. The Ukrainians will continue to fight on, and we will continue to supply them with weaponry, as will the Europeans. And so this will go on and on. And the Ukrainians are now not just intent on taking back what was taken taken this year by Russia, but taking back what was taken in 2014. So they're not going to stop unless they, really suffer big defeats on the battlefield. And I will predict that they won't, because it will take the Russians a while to be able to deploy whomever they call up. More people will start dying, and more Russians will become better informed about what's actually happening. And there is now, with this mobilization, which is one of the reasons Putin didn't do it before, although he hasn't done a general conscription. And the reason is just that wouldn't be very effective. You need training on the weapons. You can't do what they used to do in the Second World War and just give boys a gun and send them out there. And so this will just grind on and grind on. And Putin does not have an infinite amount of time, just as Ukraine does not have an infinite amount of time here, because we are starting to see a few little rumbles in Russian society that things are not going as planned. They're not going very well. And what's interesting is that it's coming from security elites near Putin, who I think are the only ones who could actually, loosen his grip on power and possibly get him to resign. And we're also seeing it from, deputies in local legislatures in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And you're starting to see it in younger people as well, and acts of defiance, like burning down recruitment agencies and whatnot, and people trying to get out of Russia. So, this is going to ruin the Russian economy in the next 6 months or so. It'll hit people harder than it has so far, eventually the two sides will have to negotiate. The big question is, when will that be, and how many people will die before that on both sides? So I wouldn't see a quick resolution. So 5 years from now, where is Ukraine? I know what they hope from talking to members of the Ukrainian government, which is that they have the territorial integrity they had in 2013, that they are members of the European Union and possibly members of NATO now, which was not something they were going to do in February of this year, by the way, be members of NATO. And with Crimea, again, part of it, and Mr. Putin out of power. That's what they hope for. Will they get all of those things? Well, I think they're going to get the European Union, even in a reduced form. And turns out you don't need to be a member of NATO to be getting a lot of NATO weaponry and training. And I think that's going to continue, because this is kind of viewed by the West now as existential for the post-World War II order, and whereby we respect the sovereignty of states, and we evidently won't tolerate this. So in the near term, long answer, as my kids would say, long answer, short question. In the near term, I think unfortunately, we're going to see an intensification of conflict here. And in the longer term, I think we'll have perhaps a new form of autocracy in Russia, but still an autocracy with or without Vladimir Putin. And Ukrainians increasingly unwilling to give up territory. So hard to see a way out soon.
Thank you for that answer. Very, very, very fascinating to consider. I know we're almost out of time. This is something I always ask my guests. It's a bit of a big question, but I try to do it to be as critical as possible, but what are we missing? What did we miss about this? You kind of alluded to underestimating Russian power at the beginning of our conversation, but did you find anything else so far in either media, even academics? What are we not understanding? What are the critical questions we should be asking to better understand this conflict? And yeah.
Yeah, so I think, one of the points of my my book, Russia Resurrected, is that, in terms of US foreign policy, we took our eyes off the ball with respect to Russia and focused on China
Right.
as a threat. And we too narrowly construed what is power in the international system in the 21st century. And power is not just the size of your military, the size of your economy, and how big your population is. It is also, what resources that you have in terms of being able to change the information environment, in terms of having a chokehold on global energy markets, and also, gradually using so-called sharp power and even soft power to assert influence in other parts of the world. I think that we looked at power too narrowly and underestimated Russia. And so here we are, because there are a lot of other countries, not just China and India, but also sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll see this at the UN General Assembly this week, who are empathetic to Russia's worldview, who see the West as interfering and liberal democracy as exhausted. And so, this is another thing I think we're missing, is our example at home matters abroad. Right. And, we are empowering people like Vladimir Putin when we undermine our own electoral system, undermine our own democracy by pretending that election results are illegitimate somehow because your side didn't win. And so I think that's a lot that has not been, emphasized, is our example matters in the world. Our leadership matters, and we delegitimize ourselves and our form of government by carrying on this way.
Dr. Kathryn Stoner, thank you so much. Are you active on Twitter? Do you want to plug where we can find the book, wherever we can find your work, and how we can follow you? Yeah.
Sure. I'm at Kath_Stoner on Twitter. And
just for listeners, that's KATH_Stoner.
Yep,
is that correct?
STONER on Twitter. And my book is available on Amazon in Kindle and hardback, and also Audible, I heard. And it's also available through Oxford University Press. And you can find some of my recent work in the Journal of Democracy as well on Putin, on the effect of this war on Russia itself.
Dr. Stoner, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.